Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webcast, Demand Response Connected Programs. I'm Christine Riker with Energy Solutions, and I'll be the moderator for this session. We'll start this webcast with a few housekeeping announcements and then quickly move on to our presentations. First and foremost, definitely want to thank all of our sponsors and ACEEE ally members for their support of the Hot Water Forum and ACEEE. Please use the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen to ask questions of the presenters. Presenters will not be able to respond to your questions in the chat, so as a moderator, I'll gather all the questions and share for the presenters to answer once all the presentations are complete. If we don't get to your question, definitely join us for the 20 minutes of discussion on the Zoom platform immediately following the session. The Zoom link is posted on the audience screen at the very bottom. Please refrain from using the chat for any dialogue other than just asking questions. Be sure to check out all the tabs on the left-hand side of the app. From there, you can network with attendees and program participants, visit sponsor pages, engage in our game to possibly win a free registration to the 2023 Hot Water Forum in Mission Hills, California. The resources section includes the program and a list of attendees for downloading. Lastly, we ask everyone to please help in our planning of future Hot Water Forums by completing the conference evaluation. Anyone who completes the evaluation and includes a testimonial will receive a $25 discount off their 2023 Hot Water Forum registration. Also, all presentations will be available for on-demand viewing to registered attendees on this Socio platform within a few days and will remain available for viewing until May. Presenter slides can be found on their page in the program participants section. And now, drumroll, I would like to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. They are Elaine Hale, Senior Research Engineer, and Drew Scatizzi, Business Development Manager. We'll start with our first speaker, Elaine Hale. Elaine is a Senior Research Engineer at the National Renewable Energy Lab. She has expertise in computational systems engineering, numerical optimization, and software development with key applications in power systems planning and building energy modeling. Elaine will be presenting on a recent study that provided physically realistic estimates of electric water heater demand response capacity. Take it away, Elaine.
Thanks, Christine. Good day, everyone, and thanks to Christine and to the conference organizers for the opportunity to present this work. My talk today is on physically realistic estimates of electric water heater demand response resource, which is joint work with my co-authors Matt Leach, Brady Cowie-Stoll, Yashen Lin, and Daniel Levy. Demand response, that is reducing, shifting, or modulating load to provide a grid service, has been around for decades. But what is a grid service, and which ones are valuable for demand response? Grid services arise out of the need to balance electricity supply and demand at all timescales. It makes sense for demand response to contribute to grid services for which the system costs avoided by demand response are sufficient to cover the administrative, enablement, and opportunity costs associated with demand response. As shown here for the Independent System Operator of New England, or ISO New England, at the transmission scale, the main system costs are for energy to serve load at all times, capacity to ensure the system can meet peak loads in the face of multiple uncertainties, and transmission. Residential demand response is often a capacity resource asked to reduce load at peak times and compensated on the retail side through an incentive payment. Historically, most demand response programs have focused on capacity service because capacity needs are generally concentrated in a few dozen hours of the year, and this tends to align well with the corresponding opportunity costs of providing demand response. Looking forward to systems with more variable renewable energy like wind and solar, we expect more opportunities and more value for demand response. Capacity will still be an important grid service for DR to provide, but energy shifting could also help integrate new resources on a day-to-day basis. This study takes a close look at the ability of electric water heaters to reduce load during stressful times and to shift energy use from low to high price times, since those services are most valuable and important for renewables integration. Our description of realistic electric water heaters comes from ResStock. ResStock is a detailed simulation model of U.S. housing stock created by automatically generating hundreds of thousands of sample Energy Plus runs based on hundreds of conditional probability distributions. Rustock estimates about 620,000 electric water heaters in New England, predominantly electric resistance water heaters with tanks. We use the standard Rustock portfolio's electric resistance water heaters to examine the demand response potential of that technology. A slightly scaled to 620,000 water heaters exactly version of the starting load profile for that scenario is shown here in black. We also run a what if scenario in which all of the New England electric water heaters are replaced with a heat pump water heater model. The resulting starting load curve, also scaled to 620,000 water heaters exactly, is shown in gray. This is obviously not the first study to look at water heater demand response. A number of grid integration studies have included water heater demand response. However, those studies can be characterized by rough assumptions on how much water heater load might be sheddable and shiftable, and for how long. Further, the physical power capacity of the water heaters is generally unknown in these studies. Tank losses are not accounted for, and heat pump water heaters are understudied in this context. There have also been pilot projects and laboratory tests. Both types of real-world experiments are important for ground truthing what water heaters can really do, but are limited in terms of how much data, in terms of both the number of water heaters and the number of load modulation events they are able to collect. In this study, we explicitly examined the aggregation problem for water heaters providing demand response in bulk power systems. Mechanically, we do this by starting with individual water heaters as modeled in Rustock. We then estimate the operational flexibility of those water heaters using a dynamic surrogate or reduced form model, and aggregate either the dynamic surrogate models themselves or the individual surrogate responses to the megawatt scale. The impact of the resources is then measured in an operational model of the New England power system. Philosophically, we are taking this approach for two reasons. First, we want to start from detailed building energy models to ensure that we aren't missing key characteristics of the water heaters when we estimate demand response source. Second, this structure gives us additional insight into what aggregators have to do to bridge the gap from kilowatt scale resources to megawatt scale grid operations. Now I want to turn to looking more directly at how water heaters can be operated flexibly. This slide shows some individual water heater responses to a shed event. In each column, there is an electric resistance water heater response and a heat pump water heater response. The no response column on the left just emphasizes that when there is no baseline load, which we can see in the upper left-hand plot during the event time, which is shown in gray, no response is possible. On the right, full response shows the expected behavior of shedding all load during the event time in the case when the water heater under baseline conditions would be running the whole time. In the middle, we see the more interesting partial response cases. The heat pump water heater partial response is just due to the water heater not being on for the whole event period under the baseline conditions. The electric resistance water heater partial response is due to the tank temperature being too low to support a response during the whole event, even though the water heater would normally be on the whole time. And this brings up some particulars about the modeling context that turned out to be important. First, the electric resistance water heater average tank temperature differs significantly from and is often higher than temperature measurements, the temperature measurements that are used to control the heating elements. Second, and unfortunately, these results are also subject to a Rustock bug that was recently fixed. These results use water heater models with power capacities over 3 times smaller than they should be. It is unclear exactly how a higher power capacity would affect these results. However, we do know that these simulations have the water heaters running about 3 times longer than is realistic. This may result in lower average tank temperatures overall, but it might not impact our demand response resource results too much, since in that case we focused on hourly results rather than the 5-minute time step results that are shown here. So given our ResStock models and a sense of how the operations could be modulated to get a flexible response, for instance, in response to a shed event, we kind of started there, and then we built up these surrogate flexibility models to more systematically represent just how these water heaters could be operated flexibly under a couple different conditions. These surrogate models are dynamic battery-like models, and we create one per water heater. And these models have power bounds that capture the ability to turn water heaters on or off relative to baseline operations. And they also have energy bounds that capture how long the water heater can be kept on or off before reaching a temperature bound. We created two flavors of this surrogate model. The simple model assumes that the tank is always at set point under baseline conditions, while the tank T model accounts for the actual average tank temperature during the baseline ResStock run. We also made a couple of different versions of this model in terms of what how the energy bounds were set. When we wanted to look at a capacity-like response, then we set the highest temperature bound to be equal to the regular set point, which was 125 degrees Fahrenheit. And we set the lower temperature set point bound to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Then when we looked at shifting, we made a symmetric assumption that the upper bound on the temperature set point could be 145 degrees Fahrenheit, which would obviously require a tempering valve to be feasible in actual water heaters, and might still be a little bit too high relative to industry practice. These surrogate models also contain a couple of important parameters. First, there's conversion efficiency from electricity to thermal energy. In the electric resistance water heaters, the efficiency is just 1. But in the heat pump water heaters, the efficiency varies with both tank temperature and ambient temperature. And so we get an overall time varying temperature, and the distribution we saw in our portfolio is shown there on the right. We also looked at tank losses, and those were all found to be less than 1% per hour for all of the water heater models in our study. This just shows the distribution of baseline power values, and then the distribution of lower and upper bounds on the change in power that we used in the surrogate model. As we talked about before, the electric resistance water heaters, the overall capacity was lower than it really should have been, and we can see that in our models we had power capacities of 1.3 kilowatts or 1.6 kilowatts. And the ability when we're operating flexibly to reduce load is just the ability to shed that baseline load. And so the middle distributions echo the distributions that are on the left. And our ability to increase load is the power capacity of the water heaters minus baseline. And so that's what we see on the right. This slide shows surrogate model estimates of how much thermal energy is stored in the tanks and summarizes how much that is allowed to change when the temperature set point is reduced to respond to a demand response shed event. Stored thermal energy is measured in energy units and is equal to the thermal capacitance of the water in the tank times the difference in temperature between the hot water in the tank and the ambient air outside the tank. This may not be an intuitive concept. The main idea is that if the air surrounding the tank was 125 degrees Fahrenheit, you wouldn't need a water heater, and the tank wouldn't be storing any thermal energy relative to its surroundings, because you could simply heat the water by letting it sit there long enough. In contrast, if the water heater is sitting in a cold room, the fact that the water in the tank is at 125 degrees Fahrenheit represents a significant investment of energy, especially if the tank is large, and so the stored thermal energy is correspondingly high. The heat pump water heater simple distribution only shows differences in stored thermal energy due to differences in ambient temperature, because the tank volumes used in our Energy Plus models in this case were all the same. The heat pump water heater tank T distribution adds in the effect of tank temperature not always being at set point. The energy stored in the electric resistance water heaters varies based on these effects and the different tank volumes of those water heaters. The surrogate models focus not on total thermal energy stored, but on the bounds that limit how much the stored energy is allowed to deviate from baseline. Measured in temperature, the allowed deviation is simply 20 degrees Fahrenheit in the simple model, and actual tank temperature minus 105 degrees Fahrenheit in the tank T model. Translated into energy terms, we get smaller values for the electric resistance water heaters because their volumes are smaller, 1 to 3 kilowatt hours, compared to the 3.5 kilowatt hours for the heat pump water heaters, both under simple assumptions. Accounting for tank temperature reduces the allowed change in stored energy. So once we created all of these individual surrogate models, we worked with them both to understand which variants of the surrogate models best matched energy plus shed type responses, and we also investigated how we could aggregate groups of these individual models into models of the same form, but at the megawatt scale instead of at the kilowatt scale, and that was the aggregation process. When we compared how the individual surrogate models for a shed event compared to the energy plus responses, we saw that we could get agreement for both types of water heaters, and we found that the electric resistance water heater responses were better replicated in the model, and the heat pump water heater responses were better replicated by the simple model. Diving deeper into these results really revealed that a lot of the details in the energy plus modeling and how that related to our surrogate models turned out to be really important. And so there are definitely some aspects of that whole process that we could improve to make the resources that we're estimating kind of more realistic and better reflective of what's going on in Redstock, and then hopefully also better calibrated to the real world. When we looked at aggregation, we can do aggregation in a naive way where we simply add up the bounds of all the individual models to create an aggregate model with those kind of summed bounds. But we found that doing that can be a true overestimate of the overall flexibility of the portfolio, in that it'll communicate to the grid that there's more flexibility there than there actually is. We also investigated mathematics that let us compute a conservative approximation that's provably dispatchable. And this worked okay for the case when we just looked at a single time step and we had constant parameters in that electric resistance case. But computing conservative, provably dispatchable approximations, either for the shifting service or for heat pump water heaters, turned out to be challenging. And for the shifting service in particular, it ended up being very conservative. So now I want to bring it back to the grid. So we looked at both a capacity-like resource and a shifting-like resource in the context of two different models for the ISO New England system, kind of looking out into the future. The near-term VG model has kind of a modest amount of wind and a lot of natural gas combined cycle generation, whereas the midterm VG model contains a lot more wind generation and greatly reduced natural gas combined cycle generation. In the actual ISO New England system today, they let demand response provide what's called contingency reserves, and there's two different varieties of that. There's what's called Claim 10, and then there's Claim 30. In the Claim 10 case, demand response resources are given 10 minutes of notification, and in the auditing procedure, they get that 10 minutes of notification, and then they're asked to provide a steady load reduction for the following 50 minutes, so that the whole auditing process takes an hour. For the claim 30 case, it's very similar, but the notification period is 30 minutes and the response period is 30 minutes. So this was a good service for us to work with in terms of validating our ability to estimate how big the response could be. And it's also a good proxy for thinking about capacity value more broadly. Generally, I think if you take this kind of a procedure, maybe slightly modified, to estimate resource for the whole year, you could combine that with information on the top net load hours for the system and estimate a capacity value for water heaters. And so that's what we were doing here. And this shows the results we got specifically for that Claim 10 and Claim 30 case. We estimated the resource size for all 8760 of the year for both electric resistance water heaters and heat pump water heaters, and for both Claim 10 and Claim 30. And so here you can see those results also kind of broken out by summer week and winter week to get a feel for how the resource varies seasonally and by hour. And one thing to notice here is just that we were finding that in our models, the electric resistance water heaters were more energy limited, and so the resource for those is lower than the overall load profile, which is shown here in kind of a taupe color. Whereas for the heat pump water heaters, they didn't seem to be energy limited, and so the load and the resource size are basically identical. To look at energy shifting, we dispatched individual surrogate models against a modeled quote unquote real-time price based on pulling energy prices out of the day-ahead grid models. We also created megawatt scale shifting resources for electric resistance water heaters that were then dispatched directly in the grid models. This plot shows average shifting responses by technology, season, and grid system. First, looking at each technology, on the left, we can see that heat pump water heater shiftable load is smaller than the electric resistance water heater shiftable load, but still able to perform significant shifting, reducing loads in the evening and increasing them in early morning. In the middle, the electric resistance water heater patterns are similar but larger, and in some cases show more shorter duration shifting from evening to afternoon hours. On the right, we see that the aggregated electric resistance water heater resources have a similar amount of load as the heat pump water heaters, but for some reason are not effectively able to shift that load to other times of day. Based on examining the underlying data, the main issue is the energy bounds. The worst case assumptions we use to ensure that the aggregate dispatch request can be disaggregated severely limit how far in time the identified load can be shifted. Looking at season and grid system, we see that there are differences in dispatch pattern along both dimensions. In the winter, load is shifted away from both the morning and evening residential peaks. In the summer, under near-term conditions, all daytime load is avoided in favor of running water heaters in early morning. But in the summer, under midterm conditions, early to mid-afternoon load is not avoided, and the early morning shifted peak is correspondingly lower. So with that, I want to conclude and thank you for your attention and turn it back to Christine.
Great. Thank you so much, Elaine. Our next speaker is Drew Scatizzi with TRC. He is a business development manager in TRC's Advanced Energy Group, where he is responsible for engaging potential clients and partners, program product design, and strategic partnerships. Drew will discuss their experience with implementing grid interactive water heating programs to reduce winter peak demand. Thanks, Drew.
Thank you very much. And a big shout out to our friends at ACEEE for putting this on. And thanks to everyone who is listening. So we're going to talk a little bit about, you'll have to excuse our marketing people who came up with this great title, right? The key to winter peak demand utility flexibility. You pull that back, what we're really going to be talking about is some grid connected water heater DR programs that we are implementing for central region utilities. So Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and I think we got an Illinois in there somewhere. So without further ado, we will get right into this. This is the dreaded who we are slide. I promise no one cares about this at all, but our marketing person who put the slide deck together said I had to share it, and I promised I would. So TRC, big implementation company. We do full scale utility consulting on the supply side and demand side, engineering, environmental services, digital. Advanced energy is where I live. We're on 3 continents with right around 55 offices. But now into the good stuff. So we talk about, I kind of teased it before, right? Our central base utilities wanted us to find new ways to target a summer and winter peak. And of course, everybody knows, one of the largest contributors to residential electricity demand is concentrated in those morning and evening peak periods. But water heating gives you a unique sense because we can do summer and winter. Of course, bring your own thermostat style programs have been around forever. But going back to that central region with a high penetration of natural gas distribution, just controlling HVAC systems alone won't get you good winter peaks. On top of that, several of our clients have expressed reticence around HVAC-driven DR programs due to the amount of customer complaints that they receive. So that was what we were working with, and kind of what we came around is focusing on electric system water heaters retrofitted with a load controller in multifamily settings. The tagline here, of course, is storage without batteries. If you've ever been into any conference at all that's got utility executives around, they just go crazy for anything storage or batteries. So we liked that one. But, it is true, right? Because you get basically half a kW of flexible load. It can go peak demand, renewable energy firming. There's all sorts of stuff. And then, of course, to keep costs down, we like to focus on multifamily. And the idea behind that, the cost to roll one truck to install load controllers in multifamily is significantly less expensive than rolling a truck to 50 different single family houses. Let's move on. So this is kind of the talking points, right? And you can see where this suddenly becomes relatively easy to put it together. So it's cost effective. Number one, it's pretty cheap. The controllers are cheap. To install is cheap. There's broad customer segments. One of the things we really like about using the load controllers is they have a LTE cellular connection, and that adds that kind of reduces barriers to entry for income qualified or maybe residents that don't always have Wi-Fi or the means to connect via Wi-Fi. And then the main thing here that our utilities love is limited customer disruption, right? So generally speaking, if you adjust a water heater for a couple hours a day by a handful of degrees, they're just not going to know. So that allows that load shed, that load building feature. The DR event is practically unnoticed to the customer. And that's a really important piece to this is people in our industry, we like to get hung up on energy savings and load potential, but at the end of the day, if it outrages a bunch of customers to the point that the call centers for the utility are being overrun with people, there's not going to be enough kind of money in the world to offset what they're trying to do. And then, of course, it's turnkey. All we got to do, we'll enroll people. But getting into the nitty gritty, very similar to what Elaine talked about, right? Going from KW to MW, right? Megawatt. We want a minimum of 1 megawatt. And anybody who's worked in kind of real-time operations on the utility side knows, generally speaking, half a kW variance on the grid is nothing more than annoyance that you have to be corrected on voltage optimization. It's not really a grid asset. So we have to get to a megawatt, right? So we want to focus on multifamily properties. We really, really want at least 500 water heaters on the property. That's kind of the sweet spot when you look at, all right, I got to pay a tech, I got to order all this equipment, I got to have somebody that's out there, I got to talk to property managers, right? And you look at the bell curve of how much of a pain in the butt it is to get installed. 500 water heaters is where you want to be. So the hard part really is finding multifamily property owners and managers, and how that ties into going for the whales is if you can establish a relationship with a national chain, a Broadstone, somebody like that who has multiple properties in multiple metro areas, it's a lot easier to expand this and connect the dots. And so what the model we offer to enroll their tenants is a bill credit to their tenants, even though they're the ones who own the water heaters and they're the ones who enroll their customers. But then the non-financial benefit that we offer to the property owner is maintenance notifications. So the software, it can't obviously diagnose that something's going wrong, but what it can do is look in the aggregate and say, hey, out of your 500 water heaters, I got one that is cycling completely different than all the others. Maybe the bottom element is burned out of the top one. Um, who knows what's going on, but you need to run a tech out there. And the idea there is hopefully we can still be focused on customer tenant satisfaction. We can diagnose a problem before it becomes serious. So that's kind of the hard part, right? Once we've identified them, we convince this property manager we're going to install these goofy machines on all your water heaters and control them. I promise your tenants aren't going to know. I'm going to give them a little bit of money back. I'm going to give you some maintenance notifications. Then we implement it, right? And this is where it gets a little difficult, right? Because and you have to have a trusted utility partner that will explain to you what are the most important markers. Everybody talks about duck curves. Everybody knows the 4 to 6 p.m. or a.m., whatever it is. But what I want to really have a good look at is here's the asset I can do. Here's the maximum load shed I can provide. Or, if you have high renewable penetration, this is where I can soak up as much as possible, like a solar sponge. Or in Texas, in the middle of the night, ERCOT is like 68% wind, right? So those are the things I want to do. Unfortunately, unless I know when those are, I can't optimize it for the grid. And then, of course, data analysis, retention, and continued recruitment. We like to try to expand this into heat pump water heaters, kind of using the two big manufacturers that happen to be platinum sponsors here at the Hot Water Forum. And it works well. It can be difficult unless the customer is bought in. And that's where that model works well of the multifamily, where you have the property owner switching a whole bunch out at once. And then, of course, I give my spiel. There's a lot of utilities doing this, but I only got 4 of them that kind of said you can use our logo. So NYSERDA looked at this with two-way EV chargers. Entergy is doing this for kind of a smart community. That's Entergy Texas. BPA is doing another smart home. And then, of course, Hawaiian Electric, who kind of started all this, is out there doing it too. All right, program design. So we kind of talked about this, right? But one of the things I wanted to kind of talk about is really the marketing and outreach. This is the hardest part. And in my word of caution to anybody looking to implement these style programs is you have to have either really strong national relationships or a good local presence of where you can find these multifamily options. As someone who's had to go knock on the door of these leasing offices and you get like a part-time person who's used to showing apartments, you're never going to get them enrolled. You have to have deep local connections that can make you inroads to those decision makers. And then one of the other things, and we already kind of talked through this though, right? But it gives you an idea. One of the things that's really special around using the water heaters, and I think this probably is of interest to everyone at the Hot Water Forum, it allows you to do DR 365. And in fact, the benefits are magnified the more you do it. So this isn't a standard DR program that has limited opportunities. You can optimize this for load shedding. Of course, we talk about our solar sponge. And that's the real benefit, right? Is you can use this all you want because your customers don't know. So the property owner is happy, the utility is happy, and you get the benefits and no one knows it. We call it kind of like an unobtrusive DR, which is really what you want. So the kind of conceptual, right? So let's get into the installation. Our partner Shifted Energy is the one who supplies us the controllers. I can't speak highly enough about them. Of course, I'm in the business of touting how good TRC does things. But if you are looking to implement these programs, I would be running to call Shifted right now because they're the best in the biz. We looked at a lot of different things, evaluated a lot of different things, and there's really not anybody selling controllers that comes close to them and probably violates some kind of ethics violation for suppliers. But that's just old Drew's personal opinion. But it's a proven reliable technology. The 15-minute telemetry matches up really well with kind of AMI data that we've scraped. And what we really like is the cold water detection. And the idea around that is If something's not messing right and it receives a DR signal, it has a failsafe where it won't, unless it falls in the parameters of yes, it's acceptable to call an event, it won't. And that's a big failure we've seen on the HVAC side. Flexible and rapid installation. I mean, this is super easy. It's just a J-box and a controller between the water heater and the wall. You are splicing 220, so you can't get a low voltage tech. You're going to have to hire an electrician, or at least someone holding master electrician's permit with an apprentice out there to do the install. And then when it's commissioned correctly and it auto commissions itself, it has a bright green LED that turns on. Okay, so it's not all good though. So there are some pros and cons. The controller works with LTE and Wi-Fi. We found repeatedly in multifamily settings that the Wi-Fi didn't always work well. I'm not an IT person. I'm assuming when you have that many routers, that many different broadband signals, I'm not really sure, but I don't know if it's just the noise out there, but we had all sorts of problems. We like the LTE. We like that it's inexpensive and fast installation, and we like that you can do maintenance reporting. Those are all the pros. The cons, relatively difficult to integrate new heat pump water heaters. Of course, if you buy an electric resistant water heater, you can slap this on right now. Heat pump water heaters, since a lot of them come from the factory with like an API based connection, trying to match it up, with our cellular technology, or if it doesn't need a controller, it's not bad by any means, but in this little model that we made where you come into a multifamily and you put the controllers on, it's hard to integrate those assets, and it just requires a little bit more work. There's customer suspicion. You might as well call this contractor suspicion. So if you try to do this on where you're not doing the whole building, right? So maybe garden style apartments where there's like 6 things, and you're not getting the same kind of technicians coming in for cold water complaints, and you see this was a big problem with Florida Power and Light about 20 years ago. They installed DR switches on the breaker panel in single family homes, and then the homeowner calls an electrician and he rips it off the wall, and you have a stranded asset. That'll happen, right? Because what's the electrician going to do is say, hey, do you know what this box is? And they're going to go, no, and then they're going to rip it off. It requires property manager support, and this doesn't happen without an engaged and understanding property manager. And then the con here is in the final one, replacement tracking. So let's say we notify management that unit is looking weird. They roll a tech to look at it. They say, yep, we need to replace this water heater. They rip it out. We don't have exactly real-time information that it's been truly disconnected. We can see it's not live. We can see it's not working, but it's not an automatic. It's going to require a human to go look at it and say, okay, yeah, we need to figure this out. And then you have an added cost where you have to roll back out and reinstall the switch. So it's not all roses and good things like that. It does require a little bit of work, you can't hit the autopilot button and it goes on forever. And I know this crew, this is what they're interested in, right? So there's kind of 3 things that are the inputs: machine learning, customer specific optimization, real-time data review. And the idea here is we can identify what that load shift curve looks like and where it is. And the idea, of course, is where can we get the most bang for our buck, and it does not kind of disrupt the customer or disrupt the tenant. And we have good things. And this is where getting in the aggregate, if I can get 0.35 of a kW a day off a water heater and I got 500 of them, well, shoot, we're getting pretty darn close to a megawatt. So if I can get 3, 4, 5 large properties, we have a pretty good reduction. And the important thing here is, and that's a managed load. And we can break down all of these on the Zoom if we want, but that's the idea behind it, right? Is it's going to be tailored to each water heater, tailored to each controller, based on the grid operators or the utilities parameters that they've put in of what's important to them, married up with customer comfort information. In the world of demand response, that's a level of customer tailoring that is not common when you look at HVAC-driven programs. So we've been very pleased with this. It's been working well for a lot of our utilities. So I tail all that, and I just want to come back to what are some of our lessons learned. Customer skepticism is the biggest one. We live in the age of scams. I don't know about y'all, but I get about 30. My vehicle has been out of warranty calls a day. Every corporate person in the world has to do phishing emails and all sorts of stuff. Customers are very, very in tune to skepticism, right? So you're saying that you're going to bolt on this controller that controls my water heater. I'm going to get $10 a month bill credit. There's just a level of skepticism that you have to get over. And ways to mitigate that is have your branding really on point. With the utility, if you can use the utilities information, that's great. If you can do a web sign up through their webpage, that's even better. But you have to be aware, anything that sounds too good to be true is going to be perceived as a scam. And if you start with that to build your messaging, you'll save yourself a lot of heartburn when you try to implement these programs. Then it goes to the value proposition. There's value to be had on multiple ways across these programs. So the property manager gets value, the grid operator, the utility gets value, the maintenance manager gets value, the tenant gets value, right? But you really need to spell out how in each and every one of those stakeholders benefit from being in these programs, because ultimately the value to the grid is more than the value you're giving to the water heater owners, right? So it's important that you highlight how everyone in this ecosystem gets done. And then, of course, close the deal. And what I mean by that is this all sounds good, but I would encourage, if you're in this line of work running these programs, that you explain that this is a minimum of a 2-year commitment. Maybe 1 year if you want to tie it to a lease. However, the cost effectiveness is dramatically decreased. You really need 2 years of active demand response events to kind of make the infrastructure investment worth it. And that gets hard, right, when you have tenants, because a lot of them are on 12-month leases. So it can be difficult to close the deal. So my word of encouragement there is, if you're upfront explaining how it's kind of in my mind, is a short-term commitment, 2 to 3 years, but to a property manager, that might be a long-term commitment. Explaining that and trying to close the deal is super important. And then the last thing is, I would highly encourage either learning exactly how these controllers affect water heaters, so you can intelligently speak to maintenance that it won't hand grenade their precious equipment when you bolt it on, because that's what they're worried about, right? They don't want to have premature failure of equipment. So you need to be really, you need to not only speak exec to the real estate property owners, but you need to speak tech to your maintenance folks. And that brings me to the end. I would like to thank everyone for paying attention, and again, thank ACEEE for putting this on and the sponsors. And I will turn back to you, Christine.
Fantastic. And looks like we have time for some Q&A. So thank you again. We'll just a few questions from the audience. If you have any questions, please submit it in the chat on the right. All right, so I think, Elaine, you have the first one that's been up here. If you have any high-level thoughts kind of around a summary, kind of a takeaway from the megawatt from that study that you conducted.
Yeah, so we did look at kind of the summarized grid value for these electric resistant heat pump water heaters. There are, of course, plenty of caveats with those summary values, but I'll first just say that when we did price taking energy shifting, we saw that the electric resistance water heaters provided about $40 per year worth of value just for the energy shifting, and that the heat pump water heaters provided about $20 a year for that shifting. But that's just the energy value. It doesn't include the capacity value, which could be another doubling or so. And that kind of brings me to the caveats. So when we do this, and I've done this in a number of different studies looking at demand response value in different grid systems, we do see a lot of difference depending on the grid system. So I think the value of shifting in particular could be higher in a system that has more solar capacity as compared to wind capacity, like we had here. And kind of conversely, if a system has a whole lot of storage on it, then that's going to eat into the value for demand response, and you might see lower value. A big caveat in general for all of this kind of work is that when we do large scale grid modeling, we're not able to capture all the varieties of inflexibility that are on current grids, and so our service prices tend to be lower than what you will see in the real world. And so you can think of these estimates as conservative in that way. And then finally, I would just say that I already mentioned the bug that's in the electric resistance water heater results, so that could have an impact here. And also the heat pump water heaters were all very large tank, 80 gallon, and so that probably helped them do more shifting. Yeah, but that's kind of the summary. We saw $40 for electric resistance and 20 for heat pumps.
And that was in ISO New England, is that right?
And that was in ISO New England with modeled future grid systems. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Drew, question here on kind of for the multifamily units, does the tank size limit the KW potential, or do you have a sense kind of which size you guys see a lot of?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, 50 is common, but then you see 40s. For the KW potential, it's kind of negligible in the aggregate, right? So a 50 versus a 40, it's like 50 is commonly 36,000 BTU, 40 is 34,000 BTU, which has a slight different kind of KW potential, but if you get enough of them, it doesn't matter. And then the other side too is the smaller tanks do have a quicker recovery rate, so you have the potential to call them more often. So it's like a wash in the aggregate if you get a bunch of them. And I hope that answers your question.
Great. Elaine, you covered, I have a question for you. So you covered a lot of different things that your study worked through. If you were kind of to take a step back of what do you feel was sort of the most interesting or kind of the biggest takeaway, you gave that great summary of the energy side of it. You found that issue in the model, but kind of what's something the audience can take away kind of big picture.
I think
Or
big picture, yeah, I mean, big picture, we definitely see that demand response can provide value in grid systems in a lot of different ways. Of course, we already kind of knew that. I think it's been really good to dive into some of these details and try to bridge from detailed models of building energy use to the detailed grid models to understand more of the complexities and challenges of doing that aggregation step. We know there's lots of aggregators out there in the real world doing this aggregation and disaggregation. You know, you present this megawatt scale resource to the grid tells you what they want you to do, and then you have to make it happen with all of these individual things. And so that's challenging, and there's definitely literature on it, but I think it's been good to really kind of dive in and get our hands dirty and understand that process better.
Great. Drew, there's a question here sort of about generic controllers that work across various utilities. You know, at a high level, there's a lot of different controllers that you can pick from. They connect into different DERMS platforms, but kind of, do you want to touch a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so generally the controller doesn't matter per se, as far because like when you're splicing, right, and it's just kind of an on-off switch. The communication protocols that it connects to and which of the DERMS platforms it's going to and how they connect to the utility is where there's differentiations. The ones we were talking about are kind of with all the major ones that a lot of times are already tied in. But you know, configuring an API is not particularly expensive, right? So based on the cost, you can make it work. But if you name any of the kind of grid, you know, any of the aggregators, any of the DERMS platforms, there's dozens of these controllers. They all have pros and cons.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Kind of bearing on the program that you're looking and the goals you're trying to achieve kind of helps you narrow in which ones make the most sense. Elaine, they love your numbers. All right. The next one is, did your energy shifting values net out the cost of the controls and equipment or not?
They did not. So I know that is pretty low. And like I said, there's a lot of caveats with that. So you could think of that as a lower bound.
Perfect. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Drew, you were talking about, I have a question I'll throw in here, with the multifamily sort of value proposition. And you were mentioning that with multifamily property managers, the value you add to them is that maintenance of that window of, okay, you know, we see something unique going on with one of these units, you may want to send to tech. Do you have a sense of how often you're able to give that information, or kind of like how frequently you're actually giving that feedback when a unit at their property isn't doing so well and they can take action?
Yeah, as you might imagine, it's directly related to the age of the unit. So the older the unit, the more, and kind of goes back to the limitations, right? We can't quite tell what's wrong. We can just see that it's not acting identical to everything else, right? And it took us a little while to narrow it in. And a great example is we had a multifamily in Texas, and we must have sent like 80 messages in a week to the property manager. And what happened was, electric existing water heaters, it has two heating elements, one at the top, one at the bottom. And the bottom one was burned out. So the top one was cycling on and off all day long. So like every 30 minutes it was still cycling and it sent it. So we had to like build some logic into it and say, okay, that's a really clear one. But so based on the age, it's pretty common. I would expect some of our larger multifamily properties, it's not uncommon to have like one real maintenance notification a month to a water heater, with maybe 4 or 5 what I would call like false notifications, where it sends one and then it operates perfectly normal the next day. And very candidly, we're still trying to build out exactly what those markers are and how they look like. And that's where it comes back to getting maintenance on board, who can tell you like, all right, don't ever send me that notification again. It was, who knows what it was. And then of course the worst one is we had a power outage at a community, and I think the system sent like 3,000 emails being like, everything's down, all your water is bad, and they were like, yeah, we know. And we said, oh, okay, lessons learned.
Oh, nice. I had a follow-up, just because there's always a lot of discussion around, getting programs to renters, sort of the renter-owner conflict there, and I thought it was really unique when you talked through that you bring along the property manager for this maintenance value, and then the bill credit goes down to the customer. Can you talk a little bit about sort of that process? Is it opt-in for all the customers? Is it just you need to get all of them to sign a document when you're there installing something? Kind of how do you get them that bill credit?
Yeah. So the easy way is if it's a master metered community, and then the company is doing the bill credits for an accounting standpoint, and then the owner of the company, or owner of the meter owner, gets the credit monthly, and they kind of divvy it up. That's the easy way. And that doesn't happen often enough. The second way is we kind of auto enroll them as a participant. So in kind of the database that we're running the program for, all of those meters and addresses are flagged as like ongoing participants. They're auto enrolled, and then the bill credit is processed just automatically. So it happens behind the scenes. And then that's kind of given as it's like when the customer starts service, they just receive all the notifications. The only problem we ran into is kind of the opt-in, opt-out. We had people opt out, then we had to talk to the property manager. It's like, well, you own the equipment, but they don't want to be a part of this. And so to get around that, we included the opt-in language in the lease. And that goes back to how strong you need to have a relationship with the property manager.
Yeah, that's great. Our session is about DR, about connected. Elaine, you briefly mentioned mixing valves. Drew, are there mixing valves with the work that you do? I guess, can either of you touch a little bit on your experiences or additional load shed that you've seen kind of with this topic of mixing valves connected with DR capacity? I just talked to Drew, so Elaine, I might pop over to you next.
Well, I think we haven't yet looked at kind of how the shifting value changes depending on how hot we let the water heaters get. So we did this kind of bounding case that you could think of as a technical potential, letting it to get to 145. Obviously, that is too hot for water to just be coming straight out of the water heater, especially if the temperature is kind of changing over the course of the day as you're doing shifting. So for me as someone interested in the potential of DR, like I'm definitely curious about how feasible it would be to have tempering valves, because that would potentially make water heaters a lot more flexible if we really do start to do a lot of shifting with them.
Great.
So I'll turn it to Drew to say how reasonable that might be or not.
Yeah, it's definitely building in general. It of course makes sense. Charge your potential. I will say, when we explain all this, the different methods we can do to property managers, in general, there's a lot of concern around load building, period. They don't have any problem shifting down. They don't want to shift up. And you can talk to the adjuster of their property and they're not going to know the nuts and bolts. But generally, they just look at you and they go, I don't like the sound of that. Let's go the other route. So to get the customer buy-in has been very difficult. So even though there probably is some very good opportunities there, in general, it's challenging to do load build. Just when you talk about things through the lens of safety, people just kind of back out and they don't even want to hear what the value is.
Yeah, really good points. Okay, I think we've run through our questions from our listeners. I have one final one just to kind of take it away in sort of the future work, thinking about your programs, Drew, thinking about your current study, Elaine. What would your next study be, Elaine? Or Drew, like what's a new program that you think would be great to run? Kind of what's that next step or that future that you'd like to see? Elaine.
Yeah, I think I kind of mentioned how we had a lot of challenges doing the aggregation. We kind of started this project knowing the general idea, not knowing what kind of issues we would run into. I think and some other work I've been doing with electric vehicle charging, we've started to explore some sort of more heuristic kind of ways to look at the how we could kind of overestimate the flexibility at first, but then kind of scale it back and then look specifically at this gets really at the grid operator question of, is this resource going to show up? One way we're thinking about, is this resource going to show up, is just kind of knowing going in what the error is likely to be when we disaggregate the resource, and then asking the aggregator to be accountable by buying back the difference between what they were asked to do and what they were actually able to do. And I think if people kind of go in kind of knowing that there is this discrepancy and that we have some bounds on the discrepancy, and then there's a mechanism for truing everything up at the end, I'm wondering if that would help kind of mitigate that criticism we hear so often of, is this resource going to show up?
Sure. Drew.
Those pesky customers are so skeptical.
Everyone's skeptical. As you said, everyone's skeptical for good reason.
What I like to see and what we're working on and what we hope is take this kind of one step further of DR programs in general or grid connected assets with very limited disruption. So this works well in the water heaters for single family or multifamily. We expect this to work well in single family, still away from HVAC, but pairing the water heaters with like pool pumps in southern climates, and because those are just two things when they run really doesn't matter to the homeowner, right? But they have kind of big loads, especially pool pumps that are inductive, right? So I think there's something there because a lot of our utility clients have really expressed how important it is that demand response programs do not negatively impact their customer. And they start there and they work us down. So some of the things we talk about, the potentials, the EVs, right? With, it's a two-way connection. Well, it's like, well, shoot, you don't really want a car to have a half charge at that exact moment you needed it, and there's some things like that. And whether it's true or not, the perception is reality. So I expect us to keep going down the path of finding things we can use to turn off when you don't need them that the customer doesn't care about.
Perfect. Well, Drew, Elaine, thank you so much for your presentations. Thank you to the attendees for participating in today's webcast. Again, if you'd like to continue exploring the presentations you have heard, feel free to join us in the Zoom chat room. You can ask Elaine a lot more detailed questions about her study. The link can be found at the very bottom of this page on the platform and on the Zoom link to the left. With that, thank you all. Have a fantastic day.